voy a presentar al doctor William Stiles, que ha estado con nosotros toda la semana, el día de antes, que estuvo en el Congreso de Psicoterapia en Doñaca, con nosotros también, que ahora hizo un curso intensivo para Postgrado. Estas montañas que ustedes ven de Río podrían ser el sur de Chile, pero no, es donde él vive entre de las montañas. Bueno, el profesor Stiles es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Miami, que queda en Ohio, por si acaso, no es un error. Y además nació antes, o sea, se creó antes en la Universidad de Miami que en la ciudad de Miami. Bueno, él fue presidente de la división 29 de la American Psychological Association, esa es ustedes saben, la más importante asociación de psicólogos en Estados Unidos. Y también fue presidente de la Society for Psychotherapy Research, que también es una sociedad mundial de mucha importancia. Y él es uno de los mayores exponentes de la investigación en psicoterapia y en particular de la investigación de procesos terapéuticos del mundo. Por lo tanto, por supuesto que ha escrito muchos libros, muchos capítulos del libro, muchos artículos, no voy a entrar a detallar eso. Puedo decirles que fue el creador de una teoría, de un modelo teórico que sigue muy activo, muy popular y es usado en la investigación, que se llama Assimilation of Problematic Experiences. En breve el APES le decimos acá, o allá dicen APES. Y antes, como gracioso, y antes de eso él generó un sistema que también es muy útil para la investigación de conversaciones, del habla, un sistema, una taxonomía para clasificar actos verbales, llamémoslo, que se llama Verbal Response Modes Taxonomy. Y esto es aplicable desde discursos políticos, que va a interesar a nuestro amigo Andrés Ayala acá, ¿cierto? Y siempre él de hecho representa esta posición, esa visión dialógica, ¿no? Así que la van a ver ahora también en su exposición. Por lo tanto, esta taxonomía es de mucha utilidad. Él aprovechó durante estos días que estuvo acá de enseñárnosla y además dejarnos un software para que podamos autoaprender, ¿no? Lo cual es bastante útil y veo que hay acá también algunos comunitarios. También puede interesar para analizar otro tipo de discursos e interacciones verbales. Yo creo que eso es más o menos lo que les puedo decir hasta ahora, y prefiero dejarlos con él para que lo conozcan de primera fuente a través de su propio trabajo. Entonces, bienvenido.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Marianne and thank the department for inviting me. This is it's an honor to be invited to come to Chile and to speak at the department. I apologize. I don't speak any Spanish, and particularly if you're talking about psychotherapy, it's embarrassing not to be able to speak about such a verbal activity and not be able to speak your language. So I hope you'll bear with me. So I couldn't understand all of what Marianne just said about me. I hope she was nice about it. But I did hear a few. I heard a few words like assimilation model and verbal response modes, which are things that I've been talking about this week with a group here. I'm actually not going to talk about that right now. As I told them this morning, I think what I've been talking about I think of as the answer. And the thing I'm going to talk about today is more what I think of as the problem. So this is about the problem. And I'm going to read this so that I don't leave pieces out. Okay, so is it helpful to talk into this? Maybe so. So the question is, how does psychotherapy work? What are the active ingredients or the essential factors that lead to good outcomes in psychotherapy? Is it the therapist's techniques? Is it the theoretical approach? Is it the sheer amount of treatment delivered? How many sessions? So today I'm going to talk about three studies that illustrate some puzzling answers to these questions. First, outcomes were not related to verbal techniques. Second, outcomes were not related to treatment approach. This is often called the Dodo verdict, as I'll talk about later. And third, outcomes were not related to treatment duration in routine practice. So these are all replicated findings, but they're controversial. Researchers often don't believe them, and they keep repeating the studies. I'm going to argue that all three can be understood as manifestations of responsiveness. Responsiveness refers to behavior being influenced by emerging context. It means people respond to what happens around them, such as what other people do. Human behavior, I think, is responsive on time scales that range from months to milliseconds. Imagine mothers and babies interacting. They're closely coordinated. Paying attention and being polite to other people, that's being responsive. If I open the door for you, or if I answer your questions, or if I repeat something when you look puzzled, I'm being responsive. Psychotherapist skills and their goals involve responsiveness. What therapists do depends on what clients do. Examples include assigning clients to treatments based on their presenting problems, planning treatment based on how the clients are progressing, active listening, timing, staying on the topic, turn-taking, attunement, adjusting interventions already in progress, and so forth. There's a whole discipline called conversational analysis that's devoted to detailing responsiveness in conversation. And I've drawn an example of responsiveness within an intervention from a classic conversational analysis book, which is Labov and Franchel's microanalysis of the therapeutic discourse of a case of an anorexic young adolescent called Rhoda. And this is from there. So just before this episode, Rhoda had been complaining that her mother was away from home, leaving Rhoda with the housekeeping responsibilities. The therapist drew a parallel, suggesting that the mother's behavior was an overreaction to Rhoda's claims of independence, much as Rhoda's refusal to eat was an overreaction to the family's suggestion that she ate too much. Okay, so the therapist says, well, what they're really doing to you is similar to what apparently goes on in this family, to what you did with them around dieting. So Rhoda rejected this interpretation, signaled first by silence and then by an attempt to change the topic to her relationship with her mother. So the therapist says, when they said you shouldn't be eating so much, you stopped entirely. Rhoda says, well, I said I could get along without my mother, and trails off. The therapist slowly recognized that Rhoda had not accepted his interpretation. The therapist says, the other, she's making you get along entirely without her, and maybe some of this has to be discussed together. Actually, so after this verbal fumbling, the therapist responded to Rhoda's resistance by changing strategy. He switched instead to supporting Rhoda, in effect agreeing that she had been given too much responsibility. Usually, students who go to college away from home don't attempt to keep house. They either live in a dormitory where most things are done for them, and they eat together in a dining hall, or they live in a sorority house where some of the housekeeping is done for them, and meals are served. It isn't contemplated that you would carry a whole house and go to school at the same time. That is, the therapist changed tactics in the middle of an intervention, responding to how Rhoda was reacting. Right? Labov and Fanchel interpreted this switch as an attempt to mend the rupture in the alliance. And of course, this sort of responsiveness goes on all the time in all kinds of conversations. That's responsiveness. The first set of puzzling findings is illustrated by a process outcome study we did quite a long time ago using data from the first Sheffield Psychotherapy project. This was a comparative trial of 2 treatments for depression, a psychodynamic interpersonal treatment abbreviated PI, and a cognitive behavioral treatment called CB. The study had an unusual crossover design in which clients received 8 sessions of each treatment, and the same therapist administered both treatments. Order of treatments were counterbalanced across clients, so there were 2 groups as shown in the slide. After an initial assessment, the clients received 8 sessions of one treatment, then a mid-treatment assessment, then 8 sessions of the other treatment, and then an end-of-treatment assessment. The assessment battery included the present state examination, which is an interview-based rating schedule, dated now. It was done by a trained assessor, and then 2 standard self-report measures, the Beck Depression Inventory. The null correlations also replicated generally disappointing, inconsistent yield of process outcome comparisons. People do find some comparisons that are significant, but they tend not to be very consistent. That's my reading of the literature. So what does this mean? Does it mean that these major process components are inert, that they're not ingredients of therapy, that interpretations don't matter, that asking questions doing disclosures doesn't matter? I don't think so. The correlational model basically tests whether more is better. This ignores clients' differing requirements, and it ignores participants' responsiveness to those requirements. In effect, the correlational model makes the absurd assumption that process components are delivered randomly with respect to client requirements. That is, it implicitly assumes that what clients need is independent of what they get. That's the correlational model. So no human interaction is like that. The effective responsiveness is not just statistical noise, by the way. Appropriate responsiveness tends to defeat the process outcome model. Responsiveness implies that the use of verbal techniques varies with client requirements. That's what responsiveness is. You give them what they need. If responsiveness is optimal, if therapists use the right amount of each technique, then outcomes will be equivalent or at least unrelated to that process component. For example, even if interpretations are a crucial ingredient, it wouldn't help to give clients more than they need. Okay, so responsiveness can produce even counterintuitive statistical results. So here's a hypothetical illustration, although this actually has happened in at least one study in Anova. Suppose that interpretations are an important, assume that interpretations are an important active ingredient in psychotherapy. Okay? Then it could be that some clients are motivated and receptive to therapist interventions. That's group A in the slide. So group A clients require only a few interpretations, they catch on quickly, they make good use of them, and they have good outcomes. Other clients may be resistant or slow, it's group B in the slide. To reach them, a responsive therapist has to repeat the interpretations and rephrase them many times, and in spite of these efforts, the outcomes may not be quite as good. Possible? So, this can produce a negative correlation between interpretations and outcomes. That is, clients who get relatively small numbers of interpretations could do better in therapy, whereas those who get many interpretations do worse, even though, as we assumed, interpretations are an important active ingredient in this therapy. So researchers and reviewers who look at negative correlations like this could conclude that interpretations may be useless or even harmful. The other 2 studies I want to talk about were both based on a large practice-based sample drawn from the British National Health Service. So there's more data from the UK. The first study compared the outcomes of 3 different treatment approaches, and results showed that the outcomes were the same regardless of which treatment was used, the Dodo effect, as I will explain. The second study compared the outcomes of treatments of different durations and showed that outcomes were the same regardless of how many sessions the client in the British National Health Service, clients who present with psychological symptoms, I don't know what it's like in Chile, are typically referred to a therapist or counselor or someone else who practices within the same medical group. They say, we have a counselor up the hall, you can go speak to her. These clients were selected from a database of more than 33,000 clients, big sample. About 70% were women, their mean age was about 38. Outcomes were assessed with a core outcome measure, which is a widely used self-report symptom intensity measure used in the United Kingdom. The data were gathered for clinical and administrative reasons and later made available for research. So these were not, they were used in the clinic, they were not gathered specifically for research. Both of these studies were replications of earlier studies that we did, and actually we've done another study since, also replicates, as well as other investigators' findings. Just quickly, the participants used three forms from the core battery. The core outcome measure, which is a standard self-report measure, that's the main one. The core assessment form, which the therapist completed right after intake, which had referral information, demographics, and information about the nature and severity of problems. And then the core end of therapy form, which completed by the therapist at the end of treatment, and that reported which theoretical approaches were used. The therapist reported what he or she had used, and the number of sessions attended, and whether the ending was planned or not, and whether it was an unplanned ending, among other things. Okay, so that's the method for both of these studies. We used the data first to compare the outcomes of treatment approaches, two different treatment approaches. At the beginning and end of treatment, clients completed the core outcome measure. At the end of treatment, therapists indicated which treatment approaches they had used, and the categories that the therapist had available was psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, cognitive, behavioral, structured, brief, person-centered, integrated, systemic, supportive, art, and other. And they could list others if there were any. Many therapists indicated that they had used more than one approach. We targeted three major families of approaches based on what therapists said on that form. And this slide shows how we distinguished them. We said that the clients received cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, if the therapist indicated any combination of cognitive, behavioral, or cognitive behavioral. We said they received person-centered therapy, or PCT, if the therapist indicated the person-centered category, step one. We said that they received psychodynamic therapy, or PDT, if the therapist indicated psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy. Was that clear how we did that? Based on these definitions, we constructed 6 groups. 3 groups that received pure treatments, that is, they received one and only one of the targeted approaches. And the other 3 groups received treatments that were diluted or enhanced, depending on how you look at it. They received one of the targeted approach plus one additional treatment, such as systemic supportive or art therapy, abbreviated plus one. Okay, clients who received any other combination of treatments were not included in the study. So about 5,600 clients out of the 33,000 database had complete data. The biggest reason they didn't make it is because they didn't come back. A lot of them didn't. In fact, a lot of the 33,000 didn't even get any therapy. They were just assessed. And they met specifications for one of these 6 groups. The distributions of age and sex and other demographic variables were very similar to the full sample in this, very similar in the 6 groups. The 6 groups pre-treatment, this is important, the pre-treatment core means were not significantly different, despite the high statistical power. So they were not randomized, but they were very equivalent when they started on the main assessment measure. Okay. Here's the results. The notched box plots show the distribution of pre-post change scores in each group. The dot in the middle represents the median. The notch represents the 95% confidence interval. The box indicates the middle 50% of the distribution. The whiskers represent the range, and the marks above and below represent a few outliers, which you get with a big sample like this. Most of the clients improved, that is, their change score was above 0. On the average, they changed by 8 or 9 points on the core. This is a statistical effect size is large, around 1.4. It's comparable to the pre-post change that you see in randomized clinical trials, about the same size. However, there were no significant differences among the 3 targeted treatment approaches, despite very high statistical power. Remember, there's 5,600, an N of 5,600 here. Likewise, there were no significant effects of treatment purity. That is, the pure and +1 treatments had very similar distributions. Okay, here's the same thing in numbers. It was a repeated measures Anova we used to do this with a factor for a treatment approach by degree of purity. Very large within clients' main effective treatment, as the clients got better, quite a large effect. A differential treatment effect, that is in this thing it's a treatment by pre-post interaction, but that's measuring the effect of different theoretical approaches, was not significant. Not significant. Treatment purity was also not significant, and the 3-way interaction was not significant. Here's the same thing again in words, after saying it in pictures and numbers. First, the treatments were effective. The CBT, PCT, and PDT were equally effective. As the Dodo said, everybody has won and all must have prizes. Third, dilution of treatments did not impair effectiveness. That is, the mixed therapies did as well as the pure ones. Of course, there's lots of caveats, as in any practice-based study, and I've listed some of them. Limited specification of treatments, non-random assignment of clients, absence of a control group, incomplete data, restriction to one self-report measure, investigator allegiance. I mean, I've written about the Dodo effect before, and so maybe getting a Dodo effect is an investigator allegiance effect. I don't know. Okay. On the other hand, if one of these treatments was really substantially better than the others, I think you'd expect to see some difference. This picture shows Alice getting her prize from the Dodo. I don't know. Does everybody here know the story? I'll read it. I'll read a little bit. This is from Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, the defendant. So according to the story, a collection of creatures had been swimming in a pool of Alice's tears. She'd grown really big and cried, and the water had left puddles, and now she got small, and there were creatures swimming in the pools of her tears. Okay, and they'd gotten all wet, and they were out now, and they were trying to get dry again. And the Dodo, one of the creatures, proposed a caucus race, and this is a sort of a British political joke that you would call it a caucus race. Doesn't matter. I'm reading. First, the Dodo marked out a race course in a sort of a circle, and then all the creatures were placed along the course here and there. They began running when they liked, and they stopped to rest when they liked. So it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running for half an hour or so and were dry again, the Dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over." And they all crowded around it, panting and asking, "But who's won?" And the Dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." So you can judge for yourself whether this is an apt metaphor for comparative psychotherapy outcome research. Okay. different treatments may be equivalently effective because this is the responsiveness account. Because therapists respond appropriately to client requirements within each framework. That is, they adapt the treatments to the client's requirements from session to session and from moment to moment. All therapeutic approaches instruct the therapists in how to be appropriately responsive and to work towards the approach's goals. As a result, each client receives a different treatment, responsively adjusted to his or her requirements. To the extent that responsiveness is successful, then, clients have optimal outcomes. This account presumes that all major approaches have ways to respond appropriately to varied client requirements. Okay. Third, there's the last study. The third study examined the outcomes of clients who received different numbers of sessions, drawing on the same database. Research on the effects of treatment duration has often been cast in terms of the dose-effect model. The dose-effect model tries to ascertain the optimum dose of therapy, where dose is measured in the number of sessions. More sessions represents a stronger dose. Again, we looked at clients' core outcome measures scores at the start and end of their treatment. To assess dose, we used the therapist's post-therapy reports about how many sessions the clients had attended. And it turned out about 9,700 of clients in the database had complete data, planned endings as reported by the therapist, and they completed 20 or fewer sessions and began the core OM with a core score of 10 or higher. The score of 10 is a clinical cutoff in this instrument. I'll explain why we did that. To assess the effect of different doses, we use two indexes: the rates of reliable improvement, and the RCSI, which is reliable and clinically significant improvement. Okay? Calculating improvement rates is a common approach to assessing effects in the dose effect. Clients are considered reliably improved if they improve to a degree that was probably not due to chance, based on the 95% confidence interval. For this study, the reliable change index was 4.5 points about on the core. So we considered changes larger than 4.5 as reliable. This means that there was a better than 95% chance that it wasn't just by chance. Jacobson and Truax, who've written about this, argued further that a change could be considered as clinically significant if the client entered treatment in a dysfunctional state and left in a normal state. So they suggested this could be understood as moving from above to below a cutoff between the dysfunctional and normal population. So we used the core cutoff of 10, which is based on a general population survey. Okay, so that's what we used. So we can summarize. We considered clients as having achieved reliable and clinically significant improvement if their core score changed at least 4.5s and went from above 10 to below 10. We included only clients whose pre-treatment core was 10 or higher, because if they started below 10, then they couldn't, by definition, move from above to below, and so they couldn't possibly achieve reliable and clinically significant change. So that's why we still do this. Okay, here's the results. This graph shows the percentage of clients who made reliable improvement as a function of how many sessions they received. That is, they changed by 4.5 or more. Reliable improvement. The result was the outcomes were not associated with the strength of dose. Right? About 80% of the clients improved reliably, regardless of how many sessions they had. Clients who had 1 or 2 sessions were as likely to improve as were clients who had 15 or 16 sessions. The percentages are more variable to the longer treatments because fewer clients got the longer treatments and the rates are less stable, even in the goodest of the sample. So the ends for these bars are quite different. They're the ends are bigger at the lower end, and they get smaller. This graph shows that the reliable and clinically significant improvement rate was actually a little bit negatively correlated with the number of sessions. At the longer treatment durations, relatively fewer clients ended below the clinical cutoff. This is partly because the clients who had more sessions averaged slightly higher scores to start with. And they tended to be a bit more distressed to start, so even though they changed just as much as the other clients, more of them ended up still above the cutoff. Here I say it again in words. The outcome did not improve with lower doses, with larger doses. On the average, clients who had 1 or 2 sessions improved just as much as clients with 15 or 16. The improvement rate was uncorrelated with the number of sessions. The RCSI rate, was slightly negatively correlated with the number of sessions, partly because clients who received longer treatments had higher initial scores. Okay, finding that improvement was unrelated to the amount of treatment may seem paradoxical and surprising if treatment's considered as an experimental manipulation. But I think it's clinically sensible if clients and therapists are considered as responsibly ending treatment when a good enough level has been reached. Clients change at different rates, achieve good enough level of gains at different treatment durations, and when they've had enough, they stop. That is, participants responsibly regulate treatment duration to meet client requirements. The finding that rates of the RCSI rates were actually lower in the longer treatments suggests that the good enough level maybe is influenced by costs. Longer treatments cost more in money, time, difficulty getting off work, difficulty finding a babysitter, and so forth. And so clients may be satisfied with less as more time and effort are demanded. That's the study. Okay, so we just have a summary. To summarize what I've said, outcomes were uncorrelated with levels of key verbal techniques, and they tended to be similar no matter which approach was used and no matter how many sessions a client received. The results may seem puzzling and surprising, but they've been replicated, and I've argued that the problem traces, all these problems may be traced to responsiveness. So the conclusion is that linear model statistics, such as correlations and analysis of variance and so forth, and traditional experiments, such as randomized clinical trials, seeking cause and effect relationships, often fail to adequately represent psychotherapy process and outcome. Research on psychotherapy process and outcome, I'm arguing, should acknowledge responsiveness. I think alternative approaches are needed to advance our understanding of how psychotherapy works. Question?
Abrimos el espacio para preguntas.
Have you studied responsiveness before, or just an idea that you have?
Have I studied it before?
Responsiveness?
Yes, I've been writing about responsiveness for about 25 or 30 years, but study might be the wrong word. It's
Research.
I spent 10 or 15 years trying to do process outcome research, trying to find, because I was a client-centered therapist, I thought reflections are the key. And the way you would find that is I worked out of, as you know, quite an elaborate coding system that includes reflections. And I'm simplifying, but I thought maybe this would show that reflections are valuable. And the way we tried to do it was to correlate it with outcome, which just seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's what everybody else was doing, and we got mush. Sometimes you find the things, and mostly you didn't, and it was very inconsistent. And after 10 or 15 years, I came up with thought that maybe the problem is not the measurement, which is what most people think. They say, well, maybe it's not reflections, maybe it's something else, or maybe we just haven't got quite the right thing, and if we found the right measure, then that would be correlated with outcome. But maybe instead, and the problem was in the statistical model. And that the responsiveness was a way of talking about why the statistical model, the linear model, doesn't work. It's basically because it's recursive. It's because the responsiveness means that responsiveness is the, I think I've said this maybe already to you, it's the opposite of holistic reasoning, which is the way linear model reasoning says there's a cause, something happens, and then you measure the effect. It's it's like you shoot the cannon and you figure out where the ball lands, and it's like as if things it requires that the independent variable is independent of the dependent variable, and if the independent variable, which is the process measure, is completely dependent on the quality of the process and the outcome and everything else, then the model is inappropriate. Responsiveness is a way of talking about that, and the research is mostly just noticing that we have done research on this too, but that human interaction is just completely responsive. It's the whole point. So that's a long-winded answer.
Yes, I would like to add another question to her question, but at the same time. How should we then do research to grasp the phenomenon?
Qualitative case studies. I don't think that's the only answer. There's a lot of answers, but I do think that that case studies and qualitative research have a lot of problems. I think what responsiveness shows is that the standard models have also got very, very serious problems. Serious enough that it's worth looking into the advantages of other kinds of epistemological assumptions. I think that that narratives and qualitative research is a way that people have evolved to understand a highly interactive, responsive environment, and so you have some reason to think there's going to be some purchase there, that there's something good about it. And as I've been talking about to some of you all week, I think you actually can use qualitative research to do what Thomas Kuhn would call normal scientific research, to do theory building, that is to examine how well theories work and to correct theories where they don't do so well. And so that's one kind of answer. I don't think that all traditional designs are wrong or anything like that. I think it's just that there are many situations that in things that we are, as psychotherapy researchers, we are very interested in, where responsiveness is just so much part of the phenomenon that you can't expect to have cause-effect relationships that last over time periods longer than about a millisecond. That's not the size of variable that we want to study. It's more a caution to think, how could this be responsive and how could it mess up the logic? And I think the answer is in a lot of cases it does mess up the logic. So I've been going on about this, as I say, for 25 years, and the response that I've gotten from my colleagues has been, "That's a brilliant idea, Bill," and then they go off and do process outcome correlations in the next study. So there's some problem. The problem is, as you say, what do you do instead?
Yeah.
And think it's a perfect answer, but I got kind of converted to qualitative research as a result of thinking this and of sort of having dismal failures in quantitative. I still do quantitative research, as you can see. It shows interesting things.
Is this fine?
No.
No fine. What would be what would you tell or advise to psychologists to choose whatever line of therapy
Choose what approach to use. Well, I think this. I mean, I think that the result is they all work. There are data that I believe that there are differences between therapists. Some therapists are better than others. Not some treatment theories, but some therapists are better than others. Most of them are kind of average, but there are some real stars who are really good, and then there are some who are really pretty bad. It could be that, I mean, I've studied responsiveness as in terms of its being a problem for research. But I think you could study responsiveness as an individual difference variable. It may be that when we talk about skill, therapeutic skill, in a way we may be talking about how appropriately they respond to the situation, so that what I would take from this is that a skillful therapist can probably make use of any of these approaches, and so it's less important which approach you choose than which therapist you choose. But I don't know if that's a very enlightened answer.
I
don't really have an answer.
Maybe that should be for the student.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Choose whatever approach you like the most, without any.
Yes. What fits you? What
rational decision making. It's just that you feel better with some, you believe more in one another.
It may be that that people have got differential talents. I mean, for example, it's been a while since I practiced, but when I did, I was a non-directive, client-centered therapist, and I don't like giving people orders. I don't like being directive, and I feel comfortable listening to people and just saying back to them. So, I mean, I think probably that means I do that better than I would be in some other in a more directive therapy. Maybe I don't have any data for that. It's just that it's hypothesis. That's sort of like what you're saying. That it may be you choose one you're comfortable or choose one you're good at. Maybe that different people have got different. That's completely unresearched.
What do you think that will be the implications of your results on the formation or education of psychotherapists? Because I think, my question is, can you, do you think that you can train responsiveness, or?
It's a good question. I don't know. Can you train people to be more well? Well, let me take it back. Yes, I think of course you can. In fact, I think what I would say is that that's what psychotherapy training is about. Most psychotherapy training is to try to explain figure out what clients are experiencing and how you can respond to it. I mean, certainly in training for empathy, which is a lot of it has to do with learning to listen, learning about the different things that people may experience and how you can put that into words. So that's, I would say that's responsiveness training. But by the same token, I think that just everyday social skill is also about, it is also about responsiveness. So that's important too. I think it takes a certain amount of social skill to be a good therapist. Maybe. Well, I know some therapists are not so socially skillful, but they seem to look. I don't know. In fact, some of the most successful therapists are strange people. So there may be, so it's an interesting line of research. I don't know the answer. I think this is something that needs work.
You have a question.
Yeah, more than one actually, but
One,
one was
please.
close to the previous one,
Yeah.
about more like ethical issues.
Huh.
I mean, if you identify not very good therapist, what do you do when you do this kind of research? Right? Just because I'm ignorant.
Well, I haven't, it's not actually me who's done the research, but I know people who have. Well, I'm trying to think what people have done. One answer is that in a lot of this research, they, in order to do the research, they have to promise not to reveal anybody's names. And so, I don't know where that leaves you ethically. You're sort of ethically bound not to tell anybody, and also, I don't know. I mean, another answer that, well, I love, for example, Mike Lambert, who has done a lot of, he's been interested in giving feedback, and he also has some big data sets, and he identifies, part of the feedback is identifying when clients are not doing well on an individual client basis. And his approach is to have first to alert the therapist. That's probably the most powerful intervention, is to say, hey, look, things are actually not going so well here. This is because they're measuring giving people an OQ every session. And then also to provide suggestions, so that you can provide information and training and try to improve training.
Is there an interest from the therapist, interest in hearing some suggestions?
What Mike says, and I believe him, is that every therapist thinks he or she is well above average. And so they, but an advantage of that kind of feedback system is that it can show people that they're not. And my impression is that when people, that independently of any suggestions, just seeing the data, seeing that you're not doing well, is an important wake-up call for a lot of therapists. Most therapists will say, oh, something is going on here. Maybe I should pay attention to this. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And the other one was it's more about the notion of responsiveness. I don't know if you are acquainted with the work by Michelle Grossen from Switzerland.
I know who she is, but you'll have what it.
Because it's the few things I know about this topic, and she has done very nice. What is the analysis of verbal interactions in psychotherapy from a dialogical framework?
Yes.
That would, I think, matches very good.
Yes, I agree. I think that is. I mean, so that's right. I mean, she is a kind of a conversational analyst who's been in a way who studied this thing. And yes, I think that it's unpacking it, and I agree. I think that the research to be done on it would be conversational analysis. It's sort of better answer to what sort of research. I haven't done the research, but the conversational analysts have. That is to say, well, how do you understand what's actually going on in those moments? Yes. Yeah.
There's a lot of psychotherapists training the grounded in the critical feedback. When
Yeah.
you take yourself as a therapist and you supervise yourself with that take.
Yes.
There's a lot of things that you in therapy don't even realize. And
You didn't
when
realize you were
see on
doing,
tape,
yes. Yeah, I
Good
think,
work.
yes, that's another kind of answer to what kind of training you do. Well, I mean,
Just asking if I have many questions. I think it's like strange because I think your system, the verbal response modes, could be used to find also some answers to the topic of responsiveness and to link it to specific, say, episodes or moments or whatever in therapy, and not to outcome, but to look at smaller instances of the process and focused. I think it could be very useful. Because I was wondering all the time, like, it's funny to hear you saying I'm now a qualitative researcher and to hear myself saying I have been, but now I'm working with quantitative methods. It's like the word, it's like a bit crazy. So I was thinking all the time that how could we grasp and research on responsiveness with quantitative methods? Because I mean, in principle, I think it's possible to assess it and to see really to assess it without destroying the phenomenon, of course.
Yes.
Done very carefully.
And, you know, I agree, and I mean, I agree. I think that one of the implications of this, of the responsiveness thing, is that it's not a problem of measure. That is that the fact that these carefully constructed verbal response mode codes don't correlate with outcome is not a problem with the codes. It's a problem with the statistical model, and it's using them for an inappropriate way. And so that, I mean, I agree that for questions like describing the phenomenon of responsiveness, and trying to understand that verbal coding and is great. I don't mean, when I advocate qualitative research, it's not because I'm opposed to numbers by any means. I mean, I think numbers are wonderful, but it's a question of how they're used. So I mean, I agree that the precision that you work and our verbal response work is I mean, I think it's well worth while. I mean, I think the responsiveness argument just says pay attention to what questions are being asked and use it for appropriate questions. And description of the process of responsiveness. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.